Okay, Phil Lee returning with another episode of Civil War Chat. To get future episodes, click on the subscribe button below and the notification bell in the upper right. And you'll get notified of future episodes. Today is the 29th of April. It is a Thursday, the 29th of April, 2021. And what I want to talk about today is when Southern whites were disfranchised. Although today's corporate media and academia are obsessed with bogus claims of black voter disfranchisement, there was a time when Southern whites were the ones who were disfranchised. And corporate media is ignorant of this because academia intentionally obscures the history. It began after the Civil War when Republicans passed the 1867 Reconstruction Acts over President Andrew Johnson's vetoes. The acts required the former Confederate states, except Tennessee, to form new state governments at conventions where delegates were to be selected at elections in each state. Tennessee was accepted because she already had a Republican-controlled puppet government that denied former Confederates the right to vote. Until the new state governments were formed in the remaining 10 states, they were ruled by martial law. Notwithstanding constitutional norms, Congress dictated that all adult black males were to be eligible to vote for delegates in the 10 applicable Southern states, although the new state governments were authorized to limit white voting rights. Now, Southern black enfranchisement required by the Reconstruction Acts in the South would not apply to any northern state where black voting rights remained a state's right and could not be dictated by the federal government. Consequently, few northern states permitted blacks to vote, even though they had tiny black populations. And in the states where they could vote, they were the tiniest proportion of all the black populations in the respective states. Congress further dictated that Southern whites would need to demonstrate their eligibility to merely register in a complex process administered under the glitter of federal bayonets. In retrospect, it should surprise nobody that each state was, quote, miraculously, quote, able to limit the white votes to a number that resulted in elections providing for Republican-controlled vassal regimes in the southern states. Each state had multiple registrars that had to qualify for their position by taking a Union loyalty oath that had passed in Congress on July 2nd, 1862, which was during the Civil War. Known as the Ironclad Oath, the oath taker was required to avow that he never supported the Confederacy. Consequently, no former Confederate could be a registrar, whether he was a soldier or a member of the Confederate government. None of them could be registrars. So the registrars had to be people who didn't serve in the Confederate military or the Confederate government. Thus, with few exceptions, only those Southerners who supported the Union during the war or avoided military service during the war could qualify as registrars for this post-war election, to register the voters for this post-war election. Now, many of the men who became registrars because they could take the oath, well, they wanted sinecures in the new state governments, right? They wanted nice, cushy jobs, political appointments in the new state governments. That was, without doubt, some things never change, right? That's human nature. Thus, if you're well connected, that's what you seek in the government. I mean, it's going on right now. Thus, they had an incentive, these registrars had an incentive to limit the number of Democrat voters And Democrat voters, of course, were concentrated among the Southern whites. Consequently, the registrars were able to reject qualifications as voters on an arbitrary basis. In other words, white Southerners could have been arbitrarily denied the opportunity to register on an arbitrary pretext determined by the registrars who had never served in the Confederate Army or had served in the Union Army. Upon completion, 703,000 blacks and 627,000 whites were registered to vote, giving the ex-slaves a 53% to 47% majority over the whites. Now, this is in the 10 states, excluding Tennessee. Historian James Ford Rhodes, who was an Ohioan and who lived during the Reconstruction period, concluded that an aggregate of 150,000 Southern whites were disfranchised across the 10 states, excluding Tennessee, and perhaps as many as 100,000 voters were disfranchised in Tennessee by the Tennessee scallywag regime. Results varied from state to state. Blacks composed most of the registrants in 5 states: South Carolina, Mississippi, Florida, Louisiana, and Alabama. Blacks and whites split Georgia 50-50, where only a small voting bloc of white carpetbaggers and scalawags could thereby determine the election results, could swing the election always toward the Republican Party. Although whites retained a majority in Arkansas, Texas, North Carolina, and Virginia, their majorities were significantly reduced. Before disfranchisement, whites would have had represented about 69% of the registered voters in those 4 states, whereas they represented only 57% after the disfranchisement. After the registration process was completed, the Republican elements in those states used various other ways to further disfranchise whites. In Arkansas, for example, the carpetbag governor controlled the 1868 autumn elections by declaring martial law in 10 counties, where he threw out all ballots and intimidated other whites through the state's plundering black militia, which he activated for the election. In Texas, the military commanders eventually required that all elected officials be capable of taking the ironclad oath. Remember that I discussed before, the oath that said you never served in the Confederacy, basically. So if you're the only elected officials that could be elected in Texas, the only people that could be elected in Texas were people that had never served in the Confederacy, well then what you were left with were people that either served in the Union or had avoided serving in the Confederate Army. So that disqualified all former Confederates from office. So most Texas whites concluded that such restrictions provided only a dubious list of candidates, and they therefore boycotted the elections. The situation was much the same in North Carolina. Virginia avoided white disfranchisement by arranging for a special election under the aegis of President Grant's short-lived inaugural goodwill, in which the state's voters were given the option to vote up or down on disfranchisement provisions, and they voted them down in July 1869, very quickly after Grant was inaugurated president, while there was still a bloom on the era of good feeling. In general, where blacks controlled most of the votes in the Cotton states, there was little need to disfranchise whites. I mean, Mississippi and South Carolina basically were over 50% of the population in each of those states was black. So disfranchisement of whites wasn't so important there because the blacks had control of the vote anyway. But in the states north of the Cotton Belt, disfranchisement was common. Tennessee is a great example. I did not make a mistake when I said about 100,000 whites in Tennessee were disfranchised compared to 150,000 in the remaining 10 states. Ultimately, the carpetbag regimes collapsed because they raised taxes beyond the limits which the region could afford to pay, Grifters plundered the revenue and distributed morsels of political appointments to blacks who generally did not pay taxes. It was an era of misrule, labeled by Americans more contemporary to the era as Negro rule or Negro supremacy. To rid themselves of the misrule, the unfortunate terminology, Southerners argued that Negro supremacy should be replaced with white supremacy. So the only term that survives now in 2021 is white supremacy. But the misrule of the carpetbag regimes was termed Negro supremacy back then. While such terminology partly reflected anti-black racism among the whites, it also principally reflected opposition to political corruption, unaffordable taxation, and unsustainable spending. It was the latter items that caused most of the racism. In fact, the state governments that replaced the carpetbag regimes generally did not restrict black voting rights. They did not restrict black voting rights. That would happen later, and I'll get into that in a later Civil War chat episode. Instead, the replacement governments, the governments that replaced the carpetbag regimes, abolished the high taxes, wasteful spending, and the centralization of power in the state capitals that was exercised by the carpetbag regimes. So, what I'd like you to do, if you'd like to learn more about this, get Southern Reconstruction by Philip Lee. Southern Reconstruction by Philip Lee. Here's the book. It's $22 at Amazon and Barnes & Noble and fine bookstores. If you want an autographed copy, I'll sell it to you for $25 and cover the postage here in the States for $25. All you have to do is email me, Phil, P-H-I-L _Lee, L-E-I-G-H. Okay, that's our show for today, and thanks for watching.